evening has started. So, hi everybody, welcome back. Good number of you came today, thanks, I appreciate that. As you may have noticed, I went ahead and posted the video from last class. I'm just going to be posting these in line on the homepage along with the day of class that it happened on. So that's how you would find the various lecture capture videos. Also, the lecture capture videos, I would say, just to be safe, that probably tomorrow morning would be the safe time to check to see if they're up there. I may get them posted like later this afternoon, and probably I will, but just in case I have to like download it and re-upload it or something like that, it can take a little bit longer. So they would be guaranteed to be up by the next day. So do I have any quick questions from Tuesday? Anybody have any questions lingering in your mind? No? All right then, great. Here's the question you have not asked. Maybe the question that you didn't know you wanted to ask me is, where am I from? I'm from South Florida. So on these days, it's feeling pretty good today, but on Wednesday, I have to confess, I didn't make it to campus. It was a little too cold for me. So if you're looking for someone to complain about the weather with, I'm a great person for that. I do like it here, that's why I live here, but yeah, sometimes it gets to be a bit much. So today, we are going to go ahead and talk through a pretty much exclusively lecture content today. We're not going to be demonstrating anything. This is something that I do in the beginning of class, and it's really just a way to kind of get everyone started on where we're coming from and where we're sort of coming from when I say we, I mean everybody in society, or taking like a big kind of inclusive umbrella here, people in general kind of come to a place of technology and looking at technologically enabled art. We're going to talk a little bit, speaking of everybody and the idea of everybody, we're going to talk a little bit in this process of history about how some people have been excluded from this history. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about things on a kind of like world events kind of level. So when I do a slide lecture, I do obviously have a title slide, which I usually skip. And then I have these study questions at the beginning of every slide lecture. I probably might say this more than once, but if I were looking for a way to study the midterm or the final, there's a reason why I put these study questions there. And the reason is because they're designed to help you study for the midterm or the final, meaning that there might be some relationship between these questions and the questions on the midterm or final. So I don't know if I can be any more explicit about that, but if I were looking for a way to study for the midterm or final, I'm sure I will direct you to those questions. And so these are the main sort of things that we're going to talk about today. I don't feel like I have to kind of go over them all because we're going to be talking about them in the slides. So before this is like number 0, right, on our stack of things to talk about. And before we really talk about anything, let's talk about technology. We all use technology, right, in our lives. You know, we all have this little possibly sparkly brick in our pocket, right? And this is probably like the most, intimate, most frequent way that we interface with technology on a daily basis, right? And it is true that this is a piece of technology. Nobody here would dispute that. Is it also a piece of technology to maybe show somebody how to make this thing with a couple of sticks? technically speaking, or according to the sort of like expansive definition of technology, that is also a technology. It's maybe not as sophisticated as the brick, and it's not as complex as the brick, but it's also a piece of technology. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So what we approach technology, or the idea of technology with, is usually what I would call a vernacular or a common sense understanding. If you asked anybody out on the street what technology is, they would probably say, you mean like computers and stuff, or phones and stuff? And that's the kind of answer you'll get. Maybe sort of like a more academic or a more sort of historically grounded answer would be that the word technology is actually a combination of two Greek roots, and one is to craft, relating to the process of creation, and the other is the knowledge of the craft, or the discourse about the craft. And that might be kind of confusing in some ways because, well, let me ask you this. How is computer code like a piece of technology? I mean, we all probably accept the fact that it is a piece of technology, but it's not sort of a concrete object, right? It's not a physical object that has electricity running through it. It doesn't, may or may not, direct electricity, depending on what kind of code it is. But code really is a set of instructions, right? And so actually that set of instructions is a technology unto itself. So for maybe a more expanded way of thinking about technology, we could also look at new religious movements. Which a new religious movement is sort of the academic ease for cult, right? So if we look at like the Heaven's Gate cult, or maybe some other cults that have used quote unquote technology, what they usually call technology is actually like a way of working with somebody therapeutically, in quotes, therapeutically, or a way of even just talking to somebody that allows them to somehow find contact with the religious goal, right? Which might be talking to God, it might be escaping your body on a UFO or something like that. I mean, it can be anything. So basically, I just want to emphasize this idea that technology is really not necessarily a thing, right? It's not necessarily this is a technological artifact, but technology itself is really a process, and it's a way of communicating. It's actually a way of communicating with people or with machines. Let's get real here. So if we start, I could probably start further back, but we can all start at the Renaissance. And this is a pretty reasonable place to start. This is where you start getting technology that actually sort of looks and acts like technology. Not that the wheel isn't a piece of technology, it is. I just don't feel like we need to spend a whole lot of time talking about the wheel. So we can start in the Renaissance, and the other reason why I choose to start in the Renaissance is because in the Renaissance, is really the first time that you start to see technology and the development of new technology impact art. The form of art making was very stable in prehistory and then into early medieval history. You basically have people making marks with implements, right? Whether that's like carving stone, there's a lot of that, or you also have people like drawing with objects, and then sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll get people using paint. So the sort of form that art took was very limited at that time. And in the Renaissance, a couple of things happened. I think the Renaissance is definitely one of those periods in history that traditionally has been sort of like used to justify, like, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but like used to justify the achievements of white people. But actually, if you look at the history, And where these things came from, they actually came from trade routes and a lot of like non-European populations. So ultramarine blue is a great example of that. So ultramarine blue, the whole European world up at this point really had no color blue. Obviously the sky is blue, water is kind of bluish if you're lucky, but there wasn't a way to paint or to represent the color blue. And it was actually through trade routes into the part of the world that is now known as Afghanistan that they discovered a mineral called ultramarine, and lapis lazuli is what it's called in Afghanistan. And that mineral actually ended up transforming the way that the European world saw things, right? And so that's sort of like a great example of just how in the last, like 30 years, there's been a lot of scholarship to kind of take some of these things like, the Italian Renaissance, which is pretty much like, a very discrete group of people participating in that, to take that and to kind of actually like open it up to say, no, actually, like some of these developments came from other parts of the world. And so ultramarine blue was a really, and crimson also. Crimson actually came from the African continent, I believe. And then there's also new paint techniques, such as oil paint, and then the portable canvas was another huge innovation. And the portable canvas actually, they also credit the portable canvas or the development of the portable canvas to the Arabian Peninsula. So that it actually started with, the idea of illuminated manuscripts. So these are all things that had major impacts on the so-called art world. They're all from different parts of the world. By the way, I'm probably going to talk a little bit about the art world, and it may seem like I'm being like unnecessarily critical of the art world. And it's funny because people sometimes think that the art world is like full of like really liberal, really permissive environment where everybody loves everybody and everybody's happy. And actually, I would maybe argue that certainly, I think now the art world is pretty inclusive, but within the last 50 years, there was a lot of work done to get it to where it is now. And if you look at, like art in the 80s, you could honestly say things like in the 1980s that there were no women in the Metropolitan Museum, like zero. There were no people of color in the Metropolitan Museum. So if I talk about, some of those things related to the art world, just know that those are like really important and really kind of relatively recent things that the art world has grappled with, and obviously is not finished with. So if we're talking about sort of technical advances right now, the major technical advance, and I think there are theories that this actually comes from the Islamic world, although I don't think that there have been any conclusive like proof studies of this. But the idea that the glass grid and the camera obscura were both ways that completely changed the way that paintings and drawings were made. And it's been well documented in art historical journals and scholarly sources that many artists used these tools to sort of verify that proportions were correct, to make sure that what they're drawing actually has a incredibly close relationship to what their eyes are seeing in the real world. If you look at pre-Renaissance painting, it's way less realistic. You have people with like Gumby arms, and just like really weird proportions. And people can make an argument that that's a stylistic choice, but it's also the fact that drawing realistically is really hard. And having a tool really helps things out. So here you can see Albrecht Dürer. He's a really famous printmaker from the 15th century. He's using a glass grid, and he's using that glass grid to take care of a difficult problem in drawing called foreshortening. And that's basically where, like, you know, if I take a picture of my cat and my cat has his paw facing me, right, facing the lens, my cat's paw looks absolutely giant, and he looks like he's about to shred me, even though he's just his usual cute self. So it's about that distortion that happens and how you can kind of accurately represent that. And it can be very difficult. I used to draw myself, and I would avail myself of a grid all the time. So the grid sort of maybe doesn't seem like much of a technology, but it is. And also, we have the camera obscura. So the camera obscura sort of takes the grid and puts it on another level, where instead of just looking at the grid and still having to like replicate what's on the grid, with the camera obscura, it actually projects an image that you can trace. Now, some people might say, some people who maybe like, study painting or drawing might say, isn't that cheating? Anybody think it's cheating? That's good that you don't think it's cheating, because you're about to use a computer to make art. And if this is cheating, then you're in trouble. So, woo. So anyway, I think the whole idea of the camera obscura basically like gave artists this amazing technological tool so that they could arrange their compositions. And probably the most famous user of the camera obscura is this Dutch artist, Johan Vermeer. If you're looking for like a really nice date movie, there's a movie called The Girl with the Pearl Earring. It has ScarJo early in her career. She plays the girl with the pearl earring, and it's about this painter and his whole, struggle being an artist. Because in Hollywood, every artist is struggling. But as you can see, he's, this is an example of something out of a scholarly journal that's kind of unpacked this composition. And it's basically kind of asserting that nobody is that good as far as like getting a vanishing point with everything lining up and that sort of thing. And that, there must have been some use of this tool. It's been a kind of frequent topic of art historical journals, how much he did or didn't use this camera technology. And you might be asking yourself, well, what's the big deal? Who cares if these painters used, a tool? I'm right there with you. What is the big deal? There's this whole thing in the art world where artists make a big deal about stuff coming from their hands and their eye, like they have some magic sight or some magic window into the world. In my sort of like, my world, we call that a myth. But some people are really into it, They call it the myth of the artist, actually. And so another huge, this is like major, and this is something that I'm pretty sure we discussed, and there's an exam question about it. The other huge advance that we have in the Renaissance, and this again is something that I'm pretty sure is pre-extant in Chinese cultures. Not necessarily the idea of movable type, but the idea of the printing press was something that may have been influenced this discovery. But the whole idea of the printing press and movable type. And if you've never seen movable type, it's kind of ridiculous, but it's also, and by ridiculous, I mean, it's like ridiculously labor intensive. So there's like these tiny lead letters, and you have to do them backwards, and you arrange them, and you arrange an entire page of text that way, which is these teeny weeny little letters. And you also possibly get lead poisoning while you're doing it. So back at this point, they were using wood type, so you wouldn't get lead poisoning. You might just get like arthritis from handling all those tiny little objects. But basically, then you get this giant, sort of like tied together thing of letters, and you print it like, and then you get a print comes off, thing comes down. You can kind of check out this link for the Met Museum, but the big deal about the printing press, you probably may have heard in one of your humanities courses that it had this really big impact on politics and really big impact on religion because of the printing of the Bible. And sure, there were all those really big things that kind of happened along with the printing press. But what it really did for art was that it liberated art from painting. And what's the big problem with painting? Well, I mean, I don't know if this is a problem. It's actually, now it's kind of a good thing, because when you paint a painting, the odds that you're going to paint another painting in the exact same way are extremely low, right? And so paintings are unique objects inherently. They're unique objects. As of the Renaissance, they're portable, so you can move them around, but you can't have the same painting here and the same painting like over there. It's just not possible, right? Because it's a singular object. It's a unique object. So what the printing press does is it allows art to exist in multiple copies at the same time. And that's actually a really big deal. So forms like political cartoons, pretty much political cartoons, engravings, all these beautiful prints that you see in the museums now, those are all things that were not really even possible prior to the printing press. Particularly, I think political cartoons are probably the major form that came out of the printing press. And if you're ever looking for sort of a weird laugh, some of those political cartoons are really raunchy, surprisingly raunchy. So we also get in the Renaissance this sort of somewhat sexist, if I do say so myself, this somewhat sexist myth of the Renaissance man. That's not actually somewhat sexist, that's just sexist. Yeah, so there's this sort of mythos built up around Leonardo da Vinci, and I mean, maybe I'll give him a tiny bit of credit. He did actually create some technology. He also created forms of art, maybe, or I won't say created, but he popularized forms of art that weren't really considered forms of art. So things like medical illustration and technical drawing. Here you can see a cannon that he made. Yeah, there's nothing bad about this, I guess. I'm sure there is something bad about it that I don't know about, but yeah, I guess the big thing is that, I brought this into the lecture because I just wanted to make the point that it's something that, probably is unique to the Renaissance. Before the notion of a career really got going, in the Renaissance, you could have sort of multiple odd jobs. And that's basically what Leonardo is doing. He's just moving from contract to contract, like a freelancer, right? And he just happens to have people in different sort of industries or different ways of working that he's working with. When we move into, this idea that in the contemporary world, you sort of get put into a bucket, right? And you get put into a bucket of being a contemporary artist or a contemporary, all programmers are contemporary, but a programmer or this or that. And there's very little room for people to kind of move around. And so figures like that are kind of interesting for that reason. So, okay, so moving forward, we're sort of moving away from the Renaissance and moving into this so-called Age of Enlightenment, which is the period between 1700 to probably 1850, and then comes the Victorian era and then the Edwardian era, because we name our historical eras by British kings and queens. I don't know that makes a terrible amount of sense, but that's kind of how it is. So in this so-called Age of Enlightenment, the reason that it's called the Age of Enlightenment is that there was a rise in scholarship and a rise in, I guess, the practice of scholarship that happened outside of where it used to happen, which would have been the Catholic Church. So this is like post-Reformation, and you see this sort of merchant class in multiple cities around Europe sort of deciding that they want to have some of their money benefit the study of X. And that usually happens to be scientific exploration. The other reason why scientific exploration was sort of coupled with money is because we start to see the emergence of engineering as sort of like its own thing, and engineering as something that can potentially create tools and products that actually benefit the public good. So you see sort of engineering, inventions, for lack of a better word, like the steam engine or the cotton gin or, other sort of technological inventions that, rather than really being like necessarily focused around art, they're focused around people and economy. So you start to see, like, for example, here's a self-acting spinning mule, and this is basically just literally a thing that makes thread. And what's important about this is maybe a couple of things. Note that there's a certain amount of artistry to the illustration, right? And this whole sort of field of scientific and technical illustration kind of gets going as a thing unto itself. And also, this tool is a very clear example of a tool that would, I'm going to say, it's kind of a loaded word, liberates a human being from having to sit here and do that thing. So it basically, if you wanted to take sort of like a Luddite sort of, position, you could say that it destroys the opportunity for a human to do this task. Or if you're kind of adopting that Luddite stance of like technology is bad, you could also say that it alienates the human from their labor, right? And so all of this sort of discourse about Luddism and technology being some kind of like alienating force, or you may also actually, if you look into historical records, see the word perversion, that it's a perversion of the natural way of doing things, right? That whole discourse kind of got kicked up in this era. And you see also some really important tools that actually helped us create new knowledge. So Charles Babbage is probably one of my favorite inventors of the era. I actually got the opportunity to see this thing in person when I was at a museum in England, and this thing is pretty amazing. It's basically a calculator. And it's not even really that good in the sense that it doesn't really even necessarily do as much as a pocket calculator would today. But just as an object, it's absolutely extraordinary. All these little pieces are hand machined, and they all have little marks from where they were all handmade. And basically, this machine and its sort of successors basically kind of got the field of calculus going, and also, just the field of logic in general. Again, with scientific illustration, we really start to see a lot happening in scientific illustration. And you start to see forms coming out of scientific illustration and into art. So this is one of my favorite slides of today. I'll just magnify it a tiny bit for you. Oh, let's see. Oh, it's not going to let me do that right now. Yes, it will. Okay. So this is an illustration from Frank Baum, and he illustrated the Wizard of Oz, and this is actually from a sequel called Ozma Returns to Oz. And the reason I'm showing you this image is because this image is from 1901, so this is at the very end of the Age of Enlightenment. It's sort of past this point of the Industrial Revolution. And what this image really captures is this sort of cultural imagination that even at this early date, people were thinking about robots walking around and interacting with people. And, so I'm sort of like absolutely fascinated by the fact that this image is almost 125 years old, and they're actually dreaming of some of the same stuff that we're dreaming about, right? Maybe just in a slightly different way and in a slightly different stylistic tone. So let me go ahead and... So in terms of art, what we start to see after this, technological transformation of the Industrial Revolution, and also I started kind of a couple minutes ago alluding to some of the maybe negative criticism around technology and engineering. The big thing that kind of impacted people into this particular era of time, which is the era of time that World War I happened, was World War I itself. And I think that with World War I, it was the first sort of so-called technological war. So you started to see things like mustard gas and nerve gas and, trench warfare. And from all accounts, if you read about it, it's probably the war that caused the most human suffering in terms of actual people being negatively impacted that the world had seen up to that point. Now, of course, we've had, unfortunately, our world has, served up some doozies since then, and we still have a lot of suffering in the world. But there was definitely this sense of this sort of generation of men and women that were in that time period of having a kind of loss of innocence. And just this really major depression. People were coming home from war with shell shock, which basically is a antiquated term for PTSD. People were coming home with these terrible injuries and then having to live out their lives with terrible injuries. So it was just really awful. So there's just this sense of artists saying taking a look at the world where the world looks okay doesn't work for me anymore. I need to represent the world in a way that does justice to all of this terrible stuff that's happened. And so you start to see artists, and this is a great example of that, you start to see artists really messing with the picture plane and what you see. I mean, this is not a realistically depicted object at all, right? It's sort of convoluted and working in different planes. You also start to see artists working, explicitly working for the goal of their own politics. So in this case, we see, this is a Vladimir Tatlin. This is a really well-known monument to the Third Internationale, which is the group of people that started the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so you start to see art sort of throughout the early part of the 20th century become a tool for fascist movements, for the Bolshevik movement, all sorts of political movements everywhere, all around the world. It's just a really interesting time. And some people actually call this time the golden age of poster art. Also, kind of like thinking past World War I and thinking into that sort of like middle period, you see artists really like start to look at the industrial world that we were looking at just a few minutes ago. Artists looking at that and saying like, wow, that's way better than anything I could ever do. You start to see artists and curators sort of thinking about, well, maybe industrial art or industrial products or product design, maybe that stuff deserves attention and deserves to be looked at as art, which was kind of a radical notion at the time. And that's actually still a discourse that's still going on in the art world. So sort of on the edge of maybe like some of that industrial aesthetic, but also some of what people would call like a high modern aesthetic, you see this bird in space. And this is a really great example of this sort of post-World War I, optimistic, sort of extremely modern way of thinking about a sculpture, where the sculpture literally, like, everything that's the sculpture is kind of like gesturing up towards the sky. And I think many critics have called it a very heroic sculpture. If you ever see it in person, it looks, in the images, they have it at the MoMA in New York, and it looks giant. You know, in this photo, you think like, oh my gosh, it must be like, 10 or 15 feet high, but it's actually like, well, I'll stay here so people can see me. It's actually like probably about that tall. I remember looking at it in person for the first time and just thinking like, huh, that's different than I thought it was. Okay, so kind of heading into World War II, we have obviously, the sort of heartbreak of another world war, and that's something that we'll probably talk about a tiny bit as we get through this next few images. We are kind of wrapping up for today, but there's a couple of images that I want to show you. So within World War II, we start to finally see the birth of something that we can identify as a quote-unquote computer. Although technically that Charles Babbage difference engine is probably by most people's definition actually a computer, meaning it computes things. What we're seeing in terms of like something that has like a really clear relationship to the modern PC, that's not really coming up until during and after World War II. And it came up for a couple of reasons. Basically, World War II was very much a spy war, an information war, in the sense that there were submarines moving around the oceans, and people really needed to find them. People needed to know where they were, and they didn't really have a great way of looking into the ocean and saying, yep, it's right there. Instead, it was easier to just intercept the Axis powers' communications and then decrypt them, and then they would just tell us where they were. So that's what happened. They built this thing called the ENIAC, and that was built in Bletchley Park. Germany had its own sort of decrypting computer called the Enigma, and you can see, I mean, man, like, if I had a suitcase that did that, that would be pretty cool. I would totally walk around with it all day. So yeah, it's like a little, typewriter in a suitcase, and instead of a typewriter, it actually has like a hard die-cast piece of metal in it that ciphers with the text to the text. And so this is the thing that actually makes the cipher. It encrypts text according to a code. And then this is the thing that decrypts the text. So as you can see, decrypting the text might be significantly more complicated than encrypting the text. To encrypt the text, all you really need is this sort of like little tiny machine. So most of that activity of the decryption actually happened at this place called Bletchley Park, just outside of London, actually. And there's a really interesting video here about the female codebreakers that were part of Bletchley Park. Many of them are still alive. and they're actually talking about some of their first experiences with computer code and working with computer code. And then this is a really interesting article if you're like a woman in technology or not, or if you're just curious. This is a really interesting article about how most of the people that worked in computing ahead of the 1950s and 60s were actually women. And it talks about sort of how that kind of culture flip happened, why it happened, and you know, sort of what the history of that is. So sort of in terms of like the artwork that inspired, I think definitely post-World War II, Robert Rauschenberg is probably one of the most iconic American post-war artists. And they call that whole era post-war art, from the probably 40s to the 70s even. And Robert Rauschenberg sort of took this notion of really borrowing imagery from the world, which at the time was considered really radical, and that's something that we do like every day when we make art, or you know, if I post something on Instagram, of course, you know, like I'm remixing posts that I find, but this is really the first time that sort of idea of like borrowing and recomposing imagery really became something that we were going to have to contend with in the art world. And I think nominally he probably considers himself a painter, although he does quite a bit of printmaking as well. So next time we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of art and technology. We're going to kind of get into the so-called digital age. This was pretty much your like everything before pre-digital day, compressed into 50 minutes. So I will see you all on Tuesday, and don't forget to have a fantastic weekend.